Terrific. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Senate Education. We are starting today is, Thursday, the 28th of January, and we are going to pick up our work today by looking at S37. And this has, we have the lead sponsor, Senator Polina, with us. If you take a look through the agenda in general for today, we're focused on education financing on this really secondary education level, looking at a couple bills, as well as spending some time hearing from VSAC. For those of you who are new to the committee, it'll be a great introduction, and even for those of us who are returning, their overviews and updates are always informative. So with that, Senator Polina, it's terrific to have you in Senate Education, albeit virtually. We, of course, would prefer to have you in the room. But
believe me, I would prefer to be there as well.
We're glad to have you. So we will turn it over to you for bill introduction.
Thank you. Appreciate it. For the record, I'm Anthony Polina. I represent Washington County. And we're going to be talking about S37, which is part of an ongoing effort to strengthen our state college system and actually make the colleges more affordable. I'm sure you're going to be hearing a number of other bills in the same vein. So you folks really know the issue in terms of what the problem is. So I'll just talk about what the bill does as briefly as I possibly can. The bill itself does three things. First thing it does is it reconfigures the state college's board of trustees in an effort to engage more stakeholders in building the new system. So the new members would include faculty, staff, students, and others who would join the board in an effort to have more voices heard as we move forward. The new board, once established, would do two things. Number one, it would design a new structure for the state colleges, creating a single institution and a single administrative team, protecting the individual personalities of the individual campuses, but a single unified system with a single executive officer and consolidating the administrative routes on the campuses and closing the chancellor's office as well. It's interesting because in recent years, we all know how enrollment is down. Faculty and staff have been cut by over 200 members between 2012 and 2018. Yet even with those cuts, even with enrollment down and the cuts to students, to faculty and staff, the chancellor's office actually has increased in size from 29 members to 35 workers at this chancellor's office. So everybody's going down, but the chancellor's office is going up. And right now, from what we know, the deans and upper administrative level employees at the state college system are costing the system about $14 million a year. Folks hope that we could try to cut that number in half and save up to $7 million a year by having administrative efficiencies throughout the state college system. The other thing it would do is that this group would design a last dollar tuition program. You folks understand what that is. I'm sure you've probably talked about this already, but last dollar tuition program means that the state would pay for money for tuition after other state and federal monies are already allocated to the students. We also believe that one of the reasons that what this would do is not only make the colleges more affordable, but actually move towards increased enrollment. We've seen in states that have lower tuition, or in Tennessee, where they have a last dollar tuition program, enrollment in the colleges there has actually gone up because they've become more affordable. We tend to think that the decreasing student numbers are because of demographic occurrences. But I think there's a lot of evidence, we know there's a lot of evidence that decreased numbers are not just about demographics, but they're related to increased costs. The more expensive the state colleges have gotten, the fewer students have applied to and went to the state colleges. And right now, 51% of our students go out of state to go to college. That's the highest percentage of any state in the nation. Of course, a lot of other folks don't go to college at all because it's too expensive. So this new board would design a last dollar tuition program to make the colleges more affordable, increase enrollment, and they would also have to recommend how to fund the tuition program. The initial funding would come from redirecting state need grants for the VSAC grants to in-state students only. Vermont, we've been down this, we've had this discussion in the past. I'm sure you continue to have it, but Vermont is still the only state that allows all their need grants to go out of state. My understanding is that in 2017, VSAC sent $5 million of our state tax dollars out of state. This is to help people go to college in other states. We understand what it's about. but no other state allows the grant money to be taken to out-of-state institutions. Vermont's the only one. So in 2017, they sent $5 million out of state. That was about 25% of their grant funds. So in terms of funding the tuition, last dollar tuition program, we would begin by looking at the $5 million that would be kept in state a year, to keeping the VSAC money in state. $7 million or so in savings from the single administration effort. We would look at closing the chancellor's office, which has an expense that we don't need to encumber it with anymore. We would they would look at redirecting job training programs as well to see if any of them appropriately could be located on the state college campuses. They would be able to look at the marijuana tax and others. This group would then report back to the legislature on their plan to restructure the state college system without closing campuses, without undermining students' ability to take courses between colleges, and reducing administrative costs. So I think that one of the most important parts about this, you'll hear other proposals about the need to lower tuition and free tuition and whatnot. This begins by reconfiguring the state college's board of trustees so that we have different voices involved in it. I don't think that you're going to find too many of these other studies that are going to talk about reducing administrative costs the way this group would like to do. Now, clearly, they have an interest. This bill came out of an effort that you probably are familiar with. I hope you're familiar with it, but it came out of the labor task force from the state colleges. So I don't know if you've seen their report or not, but they put out a couple of reports. I assume they testified before the committee, or at least
they did come in.
A little bit. Yeah. So this bill is based on the assumptions and the research done with those folks. And I think it's really important to give them a seat at the table while we have these discussions. I think they're more likely to take seriously the need for administrative efficiencies, cutting down the higher paid administrative staff, the deans and whatnot, really taking a hard look at the value of the chancellor's office and why the chancellor's office continues to grow while the enrollment continues to shrink. So I think we'll get an honest appraisal of how to go about building a better system with these folks at the table. So that's what it does. It basically says, reconfigures the state colleges board and then instructs this new board to design a new single unified system and find funding for a last dollar tuition program. They would then report back to the legislature. Of course, it would be our decision as to whether to move forward with these things. But they would report back to the legislature in December, I believe, in this year. So I won't drone on any longer. I mean, that's basically what the bill does.
Very, very helpful. Committee questions. I'm going to, if you don't mind, just kick it off. How would this interact? Would this sort of negate the work of the Select Committee on Higher Education, or not negate? I mean, this is sort of saying, listen, you're doing some work, we know, but we're also taking a similar step, if you will, simultaneously.
Yeah, I was to say it wouldn't negate it, but it would basically be focusing a different set of eyes, a much different set of eyes on the same problem. I mean, they're going to talk about reducing costs. They'll probably talk about, I haven't read that in a while, but most of the reports we've seen have talked about the possibility of closing campuses. I think these folks don't want to close campuses. And I don't think any of the reports that I've seen have really talked about taking a hard look at the chancellor's office and the high administrative costs that the colleges have. We've talked about high administrative costs, but not in the same way that these folks would in terms of really trying to do away with the higher cost administrative personnel. I mean, $14 million, this seems like a lot to, like, in terms of deans and high level administrative staff. I mean, you put the state colleges together, how many students we're really talking about? If you put, Northern Vermont, Castleton, and together with VTC, I mean, it's not a lot of students. There's a lot of colleges and universities around the country that are larger than that rely on a single unified system. There's no reason why we have to have so much redundancy in a state college system. So I think we could, this would put a different set of eyes on a similar problem, and I think come up with a more direct, inclusive response, which would say, this is where we can cut costs. We know this because this is where we work. This is our lives.
Senator Hooker.
Yeah, thank you. Senator Polino, do you have any numbers as far as costs for the last dollar of tuition?
Well, I don't. I mean, the report does. When you can take a look at the report that the folks put together, They talked about, I could dig it out, but I could also send it to the committee, but they talked about $4 million a year to begin the program. The first year would be about $4 million to cover the last dollar tuition. And that's that's about the same, or it's more than less than what we would save by keeping the VSAC money here in the state of Vermont.
Okay. Thank you.
Clearly, that all needs to be looked at more closely. I mean, I wouldn't say that's the be all and end all of it. I think, your question is pretty valid. How are we going to pay for this?
So one thing I'm wondering, I'm sorry, Senator Hooker, did you have a follow-up? No, okay. Have you had an opportunity to look at what the competitors are charging? In other words, I've said this before in committee, where I live, it's the intersection of, you have the Albany area close by where you have Hudson Valley Community College. Cuomo seems to be lowering costs all the time. Charlie Baker also, right over the border, you have North Adams, and then you have Keene State on the other side near Brattleboro. Do you have a sense of what they are charging and what it might? And I have to say, I do have some of that information, and I'll forward it to the committee. I just don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. It was submitted to me by Chase Dobson, who's doing a little work for me.
I honestly don't know the numbers, but I do know that they've been doing their best to cut tuition costs. Particularly, they focus in New York, I think, on depending on the family income. Certain people get the benefit of going tuition free. But what's happening is these other states are beginning to move quicker than we are, obviously, in this direction, which means we're likely to lose more students to those states. So it's like we put off solving this problem. It's just going to get worse. We have a habit of doing that here in the state of Vermont.
Yeah. No, and I think for me, and we're going to hear from the state colleges a little bit later as well, just getting a sense of what this actual cost looks like, for us to become competitive, honestly. Sure. I'm also curious to know what students are graduating with now from our state colleges, CCV. What does that average debt look like? I know that there are many institutions, or some in the state, I think everybody tries to keep it as low as possible. In other words, we don't want kids to have debilitating debt. But I am concerned that we do have students that enter institutions, they don't finish, they get pulled in by an attractive concentration or major that ends up not being what they want. So it's the financial issue is an important one, and I agree with you that to stay competitive, a lot of it's about cost. The other piece of this, I would say, Senator, and we haven't had much comment on that, is what are people offering? It's great to have low costs. It's great to have minimize administration, all that kind of. But what is it that our institutions of higher ed, particularly as we look at the state colleges and CCV, what are they offering? And I think that's the other piece of this that again we're not going to really pull into. But it's interesting in all of these reports. Few times, you don't hear much about that. It's about savings. It's about this. It's about that. But it's not what the opportunities that are being presented are.
And I think part of my fear is that as a solution to the economic problems we have at the state colleges, the more they cut programs, the less attractive the colleges are going to be to students around the state. So I think that's something we need to avoid. I don't remember exactly, but I do know that Vermont has one of the higher debt, I don't know what you call it, debt ratios of other states in terms of students coming out of state colleges. And I went once when there was a report that came out that showed that we had the highest kind of debt to income ratio. In other words, considering the debt that people come out of college with in Vermont related to the kind of salaries and income that Vermont families have, we had one of the more high debt ratios relative to income in the state. So, we have to not only make sure the colleges are affordable relative to other states, but affordable relative to the folks who live here.
Yeah, good point. I think other questions, comments? If I may, just one other thing that we're going to be hearing from VSAC later, and you did mention that we have about $5 million that leaves the state and goes with students to other states for higher ed. Again, it's something that I continue to personally struggle with. But again, looking at my region, where for some students, the biggest opportunities really are in probably keeping the VSAC money in, I don't think would make a difference in terms of the incredible offerings, just because of the size of the states and the amount of dollars that they're able to work with over the borders in New York and Massachusetts. As I've said, Hudson Valley Community College, you can become an undertaker, or you can do a reciprocal agreement with RPI. It really has become a large, I'm guessing 50, 60, 100,000 students university. And those opportunities for some kids, it's just, having these VSAC dollars is what they need. And for Mass College of the Liberal Arts also, again, just going over the border, also because some of these institutions can, because of their financial capabilities, give these students more money, to make it more affordable.
I would say two things. One, at one point, we talked about, I don't know whether it was who was on the committee at the time, but we've had this conversation for a couple of years. We talked about the possibility of keeping the VSAC money in the state of Vermont, unless you were going to a college that was within 25 miles of Vermont or something like that. In other words, so it would apply to Albany as an example. I assume it's 25 miles, but something like that.
Actually, that's a really good point. I'd forgotten about that. I remember you came to Senate Ed when I was on this committee prior, and that's right. You did put the mileage piece in there, which I think was helpful.
You also have to consider that fact that if people are going to a private school, let's say in New York or Massachusetts or any other state, Ohio, wherever they might want to go, if they're going to a private college and it's going to cost them $30,000, $40,000, or $50,000 a year, you could argue that $1,000 from VSAC isn't going to make that big of a difference to whether or not they go. But if you're a Vermonter from the Northeast Kingdom trying to go to the Northern Vermont University, trying to come up with $12,000, $1,000 from VSAC may make a really big difference between you going to college or not going to college. So you have to look at it that way as well. I mean, what kind of impact does that relatively small amount of money have on somebody who's trying to go to a state college as opposed to a private school out in Minnesota or something?
It's a really good point. Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah.
I noticed Senator Perchlik has had his hand up. Speak for him, but I can see you all.
Well, I always feel honestly that when you're in the room, you're representing all of Washington County, no matter if Senator Cummings or Senator Perchlik are here. But we will take a question from Senator Perchlik, please.
Well, I just wanted to point out to the committee that we did a lot of work, the committee last year, and I see Senator Hardy just joined us, on basically trying to come up with a committee approach on the last dollar tuition program that Senator Polina is part of this bill. And JFO created a really nice spreadsheet that kind of gave it different examples of different proposals and how much they'd cost and how much the different grants are now. It was one of those great things that Jeannie always had in our folder when we'd enter the room. So we might want to see if they're still in the folders from last year, or ask JFO to recreate that, because it was a really helpful way if we're going to do the same work, looking at different options.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm glad you raised it. Jeannie, would you mind emailing that around to folks if it still exists? I can always loop back.
Otherwise occupied. Can you repeat that, please?
I can
Go ahead,
talk.
Senator.
I can talk to you offline, Jeannie, about what document I'm talking about to send out.
Great, thanks. Senator Polina, any other comments? This has been very helpful, very generous of you. What is your afternoon committee?
Government operations. It's just right down the hall. But we're talking about, we have a whole menu of election issues we're taking up today. So,
all right,
the room's going to be packed.
I'm sure it's going to be packed.
But I know you. I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say, go overturn Citizens United for us, please.
Yeah, an easy lift. No, I was just going to say, I know that you're going to hear different proposals this year about state colleges. It's something we've grappled with for years, and it's one of those Groundhog Day kind of things where it never seems to go away. But I really appreciate the fact that this committee is going to take it pretty seriously. And as I said, I think that this proposal, which is not that different from some of the others we've seen, but I think restructuring the board of trustees will make a difference. And I think taking a really hard look at the administrative costs will make a difference. And I think that we could have a single unified system with a single executive officer. Oh, I should mention the last thing is that the envision is that the single unified system would be run by a single executive office, which would be located on one of the campuses.
Mhm.
So you could shut down the office in Montpelier, which is an added expense as well. And why we don't really need a nice office in Montpelier for the chancellor's staff, although their staff continues to grow, which is kind of ironic since enrollment is down and staff and faculty we've lost 204 faculty and staff positions between 2012 and 2018. But the chancellor's office actually grew by six members. So
Yeah,
it doesn't make any sense.
right. Well, I can't personally comment on that, given that I'm not sure, what the organizational chart at the chancellor's office is. I would certainly hope that if it is growing, it's looking at issues related to philanthropy, admissions, helping the institutions out there that are on the ground trying to recruit students and raise dollars. But again, I can't comment on that.
Sure.
Other questions or comments? Senator Polina?
Thanks for having me. Do good work.
Anytime.
Don't forget to get up and stretch once in a while.
Thank you. Good to see
Thanks a
you.
lot. Appreciate it.
Mr. Desmarais, would you mind, seeing that Senator Hardy is here, and I'm sure she is working on pressing issues in finance, would you be comfortable if we were to move to Senator Hardy's bill introduction, and then you take us through both S37 and S29 after that?
Of course. Yeah,
Are you sure?
fine.
Okay. Great. With that, Senator Hardy, welcome back to Senate Education.
Thank you. Thank
Good to
you,
have
Chair
you.
Campion.
Great to
It's
have
very
you here.
Exciting.
Very
It's,
exciting.
it's great to be here, and like half my morning committee is here, or more than half, so it feels like home.
You're on health and welfare?
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's great to see Senator Perchlik, the last man standing from last year. And hi, Jeannie. I can't see you, but it's good to see your name. And Jim, you too, of course. I missed Senate Education. And in finance, I left while they were talking to the tax structure committee about education property taxes. So I'm a little antsy and eager to get back there and hear
Sure,
what
of
they're
course. So we're looking at S29, an act relating to the creation of the VSC tuition-free scholarship program for Vermont residents.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, I'm Senator Ruth Hardy from Addison County. I really appreciate that you're taking a look at this bill. We did quite a bit of work on it last year in the previous version of Senate Education Committee. I'll just give you a few talking points and highlights from my perspective, and then I know
Great.
Jim knows the language really well and can walk you through the details. So this bill started out as a bill that was specific to CCV and providing a scholarship, full scholarship for students to attend our community colleges of Vermont. That was my focus last session after a previous version of the bill that Senator Polina introduced that would have been for all of state colleges had a fairly big price tag. So I tried to narrow it down to just focus on CCV. That being said, this year I widened it out a little bit to include associate's degrees and certificate programs at the Vermont State Colleges. So as it's currently drafted, it would include both CCV programs and some state college programs. They would have to be for students, both full-time students and part-time students who are pursuing an associate's degree or a certificate of some program of some kind for, some kind of professional certificate. So it wouldn't be just for the casual student who's taking a couple classes here or there. They would be full or part-time students pursuing a degree or a certificate. And they would need to be Vermont residents. As it's currently drafted, it would include students whose full family income as defined by the financial aid sort of parameters would be up to $100,000. So that's obviously a lever that you can pull to make it less expensive or more expensive or cover fewer students or more students, but that's where it's at right now and how we had it last year. Can you all hear me? Because I'm getting
Yes.
weird internet. Okay. Students would have to be in good standing, and this would be defined by the institution. So it wouldn't be something we would determine. It would be good standing with the institution, and that would both be academic good standing and also behavioral good standing. So they couldn't, you know, rob the bookstore and still get the scholarship or whatever. That's a bad example, but you know what I mean.
Right.
It would cover tuition only, and it would be a last dollar program, which is what I heard you just talking about. And Senator Perchlik's right. We spent a lot of time talking about the differences between first dollar and last dollar, and sort of something in between. And that becomes very complicated. And students would have to apply for federal financial aid and fill out the FAFSA form in order to get the scholarship. As you may know, maybe you've heard in testimony, as a state, we leave quite a bit of federal financial aid on the table because not all students apply for financial aid. So this would require them to do so. And I think there are movements at the federal level to make that application easier. So hopefully this would help in that way too. The definition of full versus part-time is outlined in the bill, and it would be for a limit of 60 credit hours, which is essentially what the estimate is for 2 years of a program. So it would cover an associate's degree. You could get 60 credit hours through the scholarship. And we subtracted out the early college program and the dual enrollment program. So if students had participated in early college and dual enrollment and gotten credits through those programs paid for by the state, that would come off of this program, so they couldn't double dip and get 2+ years paid for. But and that's a way to sort of chip away at the cost of the program as well. The other really important thing that the bill does as it currently stands is it includes 4 full-time equivalent positions for the Vermont state colleges that would serve as academic advisors and mentors for the students who qualify for this program. When I was creating this legislation, it was sort of in the off session, pre-pandemic, and I worked pretty closely with CCV and the Vermont State Colleges and also the Vermont Student Assistance Corporation, VSAC, to come up with what would be considered sort of a best practices bill. And one of the best practices when you look at programs around the country that have been successful are programs that provide academic support and advising for students, particularly students who are first generation or low income students or don't have any kind of steady history of higher education in their family. So those students really need the extra support and advising in order to stay in college or to stay through and get their associate's degree or to get their career certificate. So that's why this includes those 4 positions, because that is considered a national best practice for this type of program. So as I said, I worked with those institutions to come up with what would be a comprehensive program. I read a lot of national sort of evaluations of other programs, and there was actually a session at NCSL the year that I was putting together this bill about quote unquote free college programs around the country and what was successful or what wasn't successful. So I talked with a lot of people in other states. And one of the states that was early into this and has a pretty successful program is Tennessee. And they have a full mentoring program that goes along with their scholarship. It's actually run by private sector, but it's pretty comprehensive, and it's one of the reasons that they've been able to successfully do this program. Let me see. I expanded it to include the state colleges this year because obviously this committee knows better than most that the Vermont state colleges are in crises, and it's a big issue, and wanting to support their efforts to become more viable and to attract more students. I believe that the draft report that came out in December, and I don't think the final report is out yet, maybe it's due in a few weeks, from the the Commission on the Future of Higher Education in Vermont, or whatever fancy name we gave it last year, it recommended that we include at least $5 million in additional student scholarships for Vermont State College and CCV students. Last year, the fiscal note on this bill was just about $5 million. It has been expanded this year. There's not a new fiscal note as far as I know, although I have alerted JFO to it. So I feel like this could be a nice piece to include in the larger package that this committee and the full legislature may be considering for how we look at Vermont State Colleges and the situation. I encourage you to hear from all of them. Obviously, UVM was also very supportive of this bill last year, as it was because they have articulation agreements with CCV in particular. So CCV is a big pipeline for UVM for students, for Vermonters to go to UVM, and they find that if students are starting at CCV or the state colleges and then moving to UVM, they tend to have greater success in retaining those students once they get there. So UVM was also very supportive of this, even though it didn't directly give them scholarship aid. They may have changed their tune, but that's where they were last year. And I just highly recommend that you also reach out to, if you haven't already, you may have already done so, but to the McClure Foundation. The McClure Foundation, as some of you might know, did a program last fall where they gave a free class to any 2020 graduate of a Vermont high school. And they have a lot of data on the success of that program. And because of it, CCV bucked the trends of the nationally, where community colleges were seeing a decline in student enrollments last fall because of the pandemic. And instead, CCV actually saw an increase in their enrollments. So the McClure Foundation has kept a lot of data on that program, and I think it's very relevant to this bill and the efforts to increase student access to our state colleges and our community colleges, which are majority Vermonters that go to these. Far more than 90%, I think, of the students are Vermonters who stay in our state to get their higher education and then fill some really critical jobs in our economy, and are just the kinds of students that I think are most critical that we reach with scholarship aid. So that's my pitch and my high-level overview, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Terrific. Thank you, Senator. The McClure Foundation, we did have Joyce Judy in, I think now twice, talked just a little bit about it. The one number that would be interesting to see is we did hear that, yes, indeed, a lot of students took advantage of that one class. What we're still waiting to find out is how many went on after that. And so if hopefully the McClure Foundation, has been able to do a little bit more digging. But I certainly applaud the bill, the idea. I don't want to speak for the entire committee, but I think we are certainly looking to try to do something in this regard, whether it's state colleges and CCV, just CCV, 2 years for enrolled students, or just to get students out there and into a class. But that was very helpful. Committee questions? Looks like I think we're going to allow you to go back to finance.
Okay.
So, thank you, Senator. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Good luck, everyone. Take care.
Mr. Desmarais, would you mind taking us through the two bills? I don't think we have to go into too much detail, but an understanding of both of them so that the committee can make an informed opinion.
Okay, which would you like to start with?
Why don't we start, since it's fresh, why don't we start with Senator Hardy?
Okay, and Jeannie, if I can of share the screen?
Go right ahead.
I guess I can. Let's see. Hardy, okay. Okay. So can you see that?
Pretty small.
Yeah, it's pretty small. Let's see. Does everyone have access to this, or do we want to
Let me
have
see
it?
if I can increase the view on here. Zoom. How is that?
Still pretty small. Why don't you just, we can all use our iPads as best we can, and why don't you talk us through it if that's okay?
Okay. So for the record, we are, bigger if I can, we are reviewing, we are reviewing S29, which is Senator Hardy's bill.
And Jim, if you don't mind just taking it off the screen, that way we can monitor if people have questions. And
Or take it off the screen.
yeah, since it's not really working.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'm not sure why it's not working, but okay.
There we go.
Okay. So does everybody have it open first? Yeah? Okay. All right. So for the record, Jim Danway, that's console. So this bill, as Senator Hardy explained, creates a scholarship program. And it begins with a number of definitions. So on page 1, an eligible post-secondary institution means any of the Vermont state colleges. On page 2, an eligible post-secondary program means a curriculum of courses leading to a certificate or associate's degree. The definitions of full-time student, gift aid, part-time student, quite obvious here, so I won't read through those in a semester. Under C, so I'm on page 2, line 17. It says the corporation. The corporation is VSAC. The VSAC shall administer the program. And it says to qualify for a scholarship, the student must be a Vermont resident. Complete the program application for each year of enrollment. Complete the FAFSA form, which is a federal student aid application. Satisfy means test, so the family or the student can't have income above $100,000, and then has to maintain good academics, good academic and behavioral standing at the school, and be seeking either a certificate or an associate's degree. So this does not include, as Senator Hardy mentioned, a 4-year associate's degree. Degree. So just a 2-year degree or a certificate. VSAC can make exceptions to these requirements as they feel appropriate. On page 4, at the top, the scholarships are awarded for a maximum of 60 credit hours. So as mentioned, that is about 2 years of school. And that can be spread out over a period not to exceed 5 years. So you can do it part-time over 5 years, you can do it full-time for 2 years. And then it says in B, line 8, that if a student has obtained a certificate under the program, that same student can seek an associate's degree as well, provided that the student doesn't exceed 60 credit hours on scholarship. And then VSAC's allowed to make exceptions to accommodate students with medical or personal leave, or students with a learning disability. The scholarship covers the cost of tuition at the school for up to 1 academic year. So scholarships are yearly, so you apply each year. And it'll cover up to one academic year on a full-time basis. charged at the resident rate, applies on a last dollar basis, and VSAC pays the scholarship funds directly to the college. Goes on to say that VSAC can adopt policies and procedures, and there's no penalty. So if a student is on a scholarship and does not complete the coursework, there's no requirement to pay back scholarship money. And then there is reporting. So by November 15th of each year, there has to be a report to you on the effectiveness of the program. And then page 6, going on to the funding, there's a VSC scholarship fund being established here to fund this scholarship program. Has standard terms for establishing a fund. Line 14 talks about the appropriation, which is for fiscal year 22, $6 million. And then that would inflate thereafter. So there's an inflation factor for the annual appropriation going forward. Lastly, the bill on page 7 talks about staffing at VSC. And there's appropriation from the general fund for fiscal year 22 of the amount of $400,000 for four full-time positions, specializing in student academic support and mentoring, particularly for first-generation students and other students in need of additional assistance. This act would take effect on July 1 of this year, and scholarships will begin to be granted for the 22-23 school year and thereafter.
Thank you. Questions? Seems pretty straightforward, comprehensive overview. Okay, seeing none, let's move on to Senator Polina's bill, which is co-sponsored also by Senator Perchlik.
Okay, so that is S37, and
Correct.
does everybody have that open? One more time. Yeah, okay. So S37 reconstitutes the Vermont State College's Board of Trustees and instructs them to develop a restructuring plan and a tuition program for VSC. So looking at section 1 at the bottom of page 1, the VSC, the corporation, currently has a board of 15 trustees. It will be increased to 19. Page 2, what's happening here is that the governor appoints 4, and those are being taken out. So the governor would not have any appointees on this board. There'll be 4 trustees who are faculty members of VSC, and that would. First trustees would be faculty of VSC. That doesn't make sense. So sorry. This should say first trustees shall be faculty of VSC, I believe, and those are for 4-year terms. And then currently there's 1 student trustee, and that would be increased to 2. And then on the next page, page 3, line 5, we have currently 4 legislative trustees. They will remain. And then there are 4 self-perpetuating trustees chosen by the board. That will remain. And then 1 trustee would be a librarian, and 2 would be appointed by the AFT, the union, and 2 would be appointed by the Vermont State Employees Association. I'm confusing my bills because corporation in this bill means the Vermont State Colleges, not VSAC. Sorry, so I'm confusing my 2 bills on the use of that term. So in this bill, corporation means Vermont State Colleges. Sorry about that.
No problem.
And then the governor on the next page, section 2, the governor is a member as well. Currently, the governor would be taken off the board as well. So the governor would not be on the board or have any appointees in the board. So that's the new constructed board is 19 people. And then there's a transition provision in terms of having people exit and come on. And then section 4 deals with the restructuring plan and tuition benefit program. So it requires that the Vermont State Colleges Board of Trustees on and before December 15 of this year prepare a report for you. And that would take into account the report that Senator mentioned called Uniting Vermont. This is the Labor Task Force report. And the board will make the following recommendations to you. First, how to increase access, collaboration, administrative efficiency, and innovation through the development of a single unified system of public post-secondary education that has a single executive office formed by the consolidation of executive and upper-level administrative operations across the colleges and the elimination of the chancellor's office. The recommendation shall assume that the Vermont State Colleges shall remain independent of UVM. Secondly, to design a last dollar tuition program for Vermont residents and how that program should be funded. And the funding recommendation shall include the requirement that BSAC cease providing scholarship tuition for our state colleges, that's so-called portability, and also would require that administrative savings from the board's restructuring recommendation would be used for tuition. And then the funding recommendation may include a portion of revenue from taxes on cannabis, redirect appropriations from workforce development programs, and include other funding sources identified by the board. And this act will take effect on passage.
Thank you. Questions? My only question, really, if you don't mind, Senator Perchlik, you were on the committee that passed out the Select Committee for Higher Education last year, and you're one of the co-sponsors of this bill. I'm just wondering, are there things that you're seeing from the Select Committee, which I assume you supported, but correct me if I'm wrong, that you're not seeing done, or if there are ways that we would communicate? For example, if we weren't to take up this, are there things that you're not seeing that this bill is doing that you would like to see this subcommittee do, or the Select Committee? I mean, there seems to be some overlap.
Totally. Yeah, no, definitely. And I think when sponsored this bill with Anthony and Senator Polino, we hadn't seen their report yet. We just kind of, maybe their interim report was out. So I think it was just an effort to have a different perspective, but on the table to consider two different ways. You know, the Select Committee is deciding to recommend a combination of all but the community college, and this is a recommendation that includes combining the community college. And this one, coming from more the labor perspective, is trying to get more of the staff and faculty on the board, and that's not something that I don't think we even challenged them to really look at that, or that the Select Committee is looking at those kind of issues about board governance issues. So it's looking at it differently. And the tuition part of this bill is just something that, you know, Anthony has put in several bills about free tuition over the years. And so the idea was, well, those bills never went anywhere. So maybe if this committee could come up with a proposal, that would be a way to get some support for it. So, but I don't think, so you'll notice I'm a sponsor of both Senator Hardy's and Senator Polino's bill. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. both are just efforts together with the select committee support to do something to improve the affordability of and sustainability of our state colleges.
Yeah, committee, I mean, we can have a longer discussion after we hear from today's witnesses, but I'm hoping as we hear from people, you'll be considering what you might want to do or might not want to do with regard to broadening access, as I see it, to our state colleges, including CCV. You know, what the work that the McClure Foundation and the generosity of the McClure Foundation, I thought was incredible last year, and certainly showed that, you know, making it accessible, people will take advantage of it. And, you know, even though I keep asking the question, you know, what happened, you know, did students continue on? Even if they didn't, to me, just taking a class, I think is great. You know, for some people, it might have been exactly what they needed for a job or for, you know, their own interests, etc. So, I mean, I put my cards on the table. I think for me, you know, giving people more access to higher education at low to no cost, quality education is something I'm interested in seeing us do something on, and what that looks like, if it's continuing sort of the work that the McClure Foundation started or expanding it, we can certainly have that conversation. Senator Chittenden.
I was just going to say, yesterday, I feel like I jumped the gun by offering concerns, and then we took a lot of testimony. So I'll reserve my remarks, as I think you just suggested, to hear the testimony and then maybe reflect more on some of my pause points at the end. Does that make sense? Sure.
I know. I mean, you're welcome to. You know, one of the things that you are allowed to do, which I do constantly, is change your mind. So please feel free. If I have a. So please feel free to just discuss or use this time in any way you'd like. Senator Terenzini, please.
Thank you, Senator Kibben. This might as well not be the right time, but could we look at Senator Hardy's bill for a moment? I have a question about that one.
Absolutely.
I'm very familiar, very comfortable in the intricacies of municipal government funding. I'm still at a kindergarten level as to how we fund state government, all the intricacies and where the money comes from and goes to and all that. So I apologize for my very basic question here. But you look at, I believe it's page 6 or 7 on Senator Hardy's bill, and it says for fiscal year 2022 and each fiscal year after, an amount of $6 million shall be appropriated and transferred from the general fund to the fund. That $6 million to be appropriated, that would come in form of, we'd have to raise, in other words, in my mind, unless I'm completely wrong, we would be taking that $6 million, applying it to this, and then we have to raise that $6 million to put back into the general fund, or that $6 million has to be raised by taxes, or the taxpayers of Vermont pay for that $6 million, correct?
Jim, do you want me to take that, or is that something?
I'm happy to take that, but it's, yes, you have to raise revenue, obviously taxes or otherwise, for the general fund, or cut other costs.
Or right, and that's the only thing I was going to add was, or cut something else would be the way to do it. Yeah. The only thing.
I guess,
go ahead, please.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, I guess my thought process, this bill we're looking at, in the scope of the state budget of billions of dollars, $6 million is to some a drop in the hat. But to me, I look at it as, boy, $6 million is a lot of money, especially in light of the pandemic and everything else we have going on. So that's just, you know, how sort of the bill I interpret initially. And I'm just putting it out there. But I guess I appreciate the answer, Jim, and I'll just hold my thoughts because I could ramble about this, but I see that number. I said, geez, that's got to come from somewhere. And
yeah,
I don't know if I'm loving the idea of it being right now.
No, it's a great point. Senator Perchlik.
Yeah, and you'll notice, and Senator Hardy mentioned, I think she did, maybe I'm getting confused with Senator Polina's testimony, but the VSAC grants that go out of state are around $5 million. So when we were looking at it last year, we were trying to find a program that basically we could afford, and whether that be some of the cannabis tax money or the BSAC portability grants. We were trying to find the money to match up with our goals. Because I think last year we started with one of Polina's bill that was just free college, which I think had a price tag of like 30 million. And we said, well, we're not going to find 30 million, but maybe we could find 5 million. And even though we talked a lot about where the money would come from, in the end, we never sent the bill out, but you would send a bill out and it would be appropriations that would decide whether, we could put $6 million in there, but they could just take it out. In fact, they will take it out.
Yeah. Yeah. And just so new senators know, if it has, and any dollar amount, it's going to go down the hall and they're going to have a look at it, and they could make edits, if you will. And the same with finance. So oftentimes committee bills, like if we were to take this up, they have more than one stop. And for example, if we were to vote this out today, which we're not going to, it would go down to appropes and it would go to finance. It's possible, another committee economic development could say, hey, we want to have a look at this because it's related to economic development. There are all sorts of, so it can be a long process. I just want to remind people of that.
And
Please.
Yeah, I think these are questions that I have that I think, and I fully support us being remote for health reasons, obviously, but I think these are for freshman legislators, and maybe I speak for Senator Chittenden as well. These are questions I probably could ask in the hallway or the cafeteria or in between breaks. It's
Sure.
just stuff that I think I'm at a learning disadvantage because I'm sitting in my basement,
I'm right there with you, Senator Terenzini. So can I just pick up on what you just said, Chair Campion?
Sure.
Did I hear you correctly that if we were to pass this today, if we as a committee were to move this out, it wouldn't go to the floor. It
Correct.
would, by default, you would send it to finance and then ways and means, and they would have to get through their committees and then to the floor. And then it'd have to go through the House, and then the governor would have to sign it, right?
Yeah. So it would be on the calendar, and then, but it would be sent right to either finance or appropriations. And then there can be, just so new senators know, there can always be let's say there was something about a health class in there. I mean, for what, Senator Lyons could get up and say, I want to see this bill. I'm the chair of health and welfare, and it's something that's important to me and my committee. And people would generally, I think when a colleague wants to see something, they respectful about it. So yeah, that is the process. And I really do hope you'll both continue to ask these questions. It's great for all of us. And I think you're right. I too support us all being remotely, but a lot of this stuff would be settled, or asked, if you will, in different settings. And for some of us, we're still, everybody else, we're still learning, so ask away. Senator Lyons.
Just a quick comment.
Please.
So what you have identified are the weighing all the goods together and then making a decision about which ones and how much to fund. So if we have a recommendation to make for a workforce development bill through our colleges, our institutions of higher learning, we just need to make a very strong case for it, because in my committee, there might be a bill on childcare, and in natural resources, there might be a bill on environmental cleanup, that each one having a fund. So it's a balancing of which good we put forward when, and that ends up smack dab in the middle of appropriations. And what we have in the Senate is something called Rule 31. So whenever you see a bill coming up on the floor, so it could be this bill or another, and John Bloomer will say, or the Lieutenant Governor will say, based on Rule 31, this bill is referred to the Committee on Finance or appropes. So that That's what intercedes in any good thinking that we have.
And I'm happy to say on the record, it drives me crazy when we do send a bill to those committees and they do something to it.
Yeah, they're not supposed
Senator
to
Lyons
touch the
and I-
policy.
Yeah,
They're not
Senator Lyons
supposed
and
to
I were,
touch policy.
we were on finance together, and when you're on finance, you love to mess, but when you're not on finance, you don't.
That's
like
right.
people do those kinds of things. So great questions. And, just to take it one step further, when we don't agree with the House on something, and, and at the end, when there is a committee of conference, when the Senate's sending reps and the House is sending reps to kind of hammer things out, sometimes those people are from multiple committees. So if we were doing this bill right now, it's not as though, I would say, Lyons, Terenzini, and Hooker are going to go represent us. It might be that appropriations would want somebody there. It might mean that, finance would want somebody there as well, representing the work that all of the committees did. Great. Okay. If people don't mind, we're going to just take a 10-minute break. Why don't we stretch and come back? Why don't we just call it 15 and come back at 2:45, a little less than 15 minutes. Thank you. It's great to have the two of you here. Vermont Student Assistance Corporation is extremely important to the state and extremely important for our work to understand your roles and VSAC's roles in the lives of our students and other Vermonters. So we asked you to come in to give us the VSAC 101. We have two new senators. We also have new people to the committee. Then there are people like myself who was deeply involved in this work several years ago and now back in it. So grateful that you're here. I also see that Mr. Little is with us as well, which is terrific. And I'm sure he will be chiming in. So
Standing by.
Standing by. Wonderful. Okay, Mr. Giles.
Mr. Chairman, would you like me to share my screen, or would you prefer I can refer to the slide?
So, I just want to survey quickly senators. Do people have the information from them? Senator Terenzini, you were having a computer. Do you have a computer with you?
So for committee meetings, I use the tablet the legislature gave me on screen, and then I have a laptop over here, and I look at, for example, the bills on the Senate page.
Great. So you're okay if we just not put it on the screen.
That's fine.
We can all go through it on our own device. Does that work for everybody? Okay, Senator Hooker.
Great.
Okay, I just want to make sure it works for everybody. Senator Lyons, that's okay with you? You're the last person I want to tick off these days.
Just be very careful.
I was on the phone with Representative Donovan last night talking about the old days. She said, "Oh, I'm so glad Lyons and Hooker are there to keep you in line."
Oh, yeah. Senator Campion, just a clarification as to whether or not others who are watching can see the documents.
That is a great point. So the documents are on our committee website and accessible that way. I'm sure, Jeannie, just to confirm, are the documents from VSAC up? I've not jumped in yet.
That's where I got mine.
Okay, terrific. So they are indeed there. All right. So let's start.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And let me begin by saying, Mr. Chairman, it gives me great pleasure to testify, have the opportunity this year to testify before the committee with you as chair. We've had the opportunity to work in a variety of other capacities over the years. So congratulations. And thank you for the opportunity to introduce VSAC. To those of you who may not be familiar with the organization, our experience has been that is one of my as my board chair likes to say, people know us based on the program that they participated in and think that that is just us. So it's always a great opportunity for us to describe a little bit more completely the full range of things that we are doing, and then answer any questions that you might have. So what I thought I would do is set the table for the context in which we're operating, and then share with you the request that we made to the governor and that we will be making to the legislature for funding, which I think is directly relevant to some of the conversations that you just were participating in. We've got some thoughts that we can share that way. I always like coming before this committee because there's a degree to which I'm kind of preaching to the choir. But VSAC was created now over 50 years ago, originally with the mission of ensuring that all Vermonters had access to the financial resources they needed to pursue education after high school. It was Vermont's contribution to the work of the Great Society. And we were created back in 1965 to guarantee student loans and to make grants. Through the years, we've discovered, particularly working with first generation and low income students, that it's not enough just to make financial resources available if you're not providing them with the career education and financial counseling to allow them to kind of map and chart a course for their own future that is both affordable and attainable. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the different ways that we attempt to serve that. And in some ways, the most visible way that I see that change in VSAC's thinking over these 50 years is reflected to some extent in a change in the way we think about our mission. We believe that our goal is to ensure that all Vermonters, but particularly those Vermonters who think that the doors to education and training are closed to them, have access to both the financial resources and the information that they will need in order to be able to successfully map their futures. And this work was critically important in 1965 when we were talking about the war on poverty. It's probably more important now when we take a look at the challenges of inequality and opportunity that our society faces. And if I look back at the Great Recession, because to some extent, the things that we learned and saw in that recession are being mapped out today. We saw very, very clearly, even more dramatically than we had in the past, that the economic impact of these events is felt very differently depending on the educational attainment of the individuals that we're talking to. In the Great Recession, to put things in perspective, there were 5.6 million jobs lost by individuals with a high school diploma. And in the recovery, less than 80,000 of those came back. There were 1.8 million jobs lost by individuals with associate's degrees, but 3.1 million of those jobs kind of came back in the recovery. And then for bachelor's degrees, despite many of the challenges that recent graduates in both settings had, there was actually a growth in job opportunities of $200,000 jobs in the peak of that recession. And then in the recovery, 8.4 million jobs went to individuals with a 4-year degree or higher. As we have entered into this pandemic, we saw slightly different phenomena, and particularly with regard to who lost their jobs. Essential workers in certain fields that didn't require as much education were able to continue to work. But by and large, when you look at unemployment, it broke out very, very clearly along educational lines. The more education or training that you had, the lower the unemployment you experienced in the environment. And both nationally and in Vermont, individuals with post-secondary education were about 50% as likely to be unemployed as those individuals that had only a high school diploma or an associate's degree. So this work is really, really critical. And I thought that I would kind of contextually share some of the things that we are doing to try and address both the needs of the state and the needs of these individuals. And before I move into our programs, the last observation that I want to make is that the nature of our work from the time that we were created by the legislature is focused on students. Our focus solely is on working with students to help them identify their interests, to be able to map those interests to potential career opportunities, and then to help them map education and training pathways to allow them to achieve their goals. Just as importantly, then, to help them figure out the ways that they can pay for these education or training programs, really with the goal of making sure that they are able to become what we call good consumers of education and training. Everyone here knows the kind of tale of, kind of Vermont's education pipeline. Our budget proposal is going to speak to part of this. But if we think about the pathway of Vermont students, we have one of the higher high school graduation rates, in the country, at between 93 and 94%, depending on which measure you're looking at. Only about 60% of Vermont high school seniors, or 55 to 60% of Vermont high school seniors, will go on to a 2 or 4 year degree program within 18 months of graduating. And then as we take a look at their retention kind of through that program at the end of 6 years, only about 40% of that class will have obtained a 2 or a 4 year degree. And as we take a look at the challenges that employers are facing, we take a look at the economic challenges that particularly first generation and low income students are facing, and we talk about the challenges that our public institutions are facing, this is really the context in which we are operating. So how is it that VSAC supports kind of the range of our students? And this is where I'll step into. Some of you may be familiar with some of these programs from your own experience. We like to think of our support for families in a birth to career continuum. In a perfect world, we are the sponsor of Vermont's 529 plan, which is the college savings plan. It is one of the quiet successes of the state of Vermont. Currently, Vermont families currently have over $500 million invested in the savings plan. This is money that they can pay for education or training. And at this point, Marilyn Cargill, who is with us and will kind of join me in the testimony in a minute, will correct my number. But the amount that is being withdrawn in support of education and training from that particular program is now larger than the amount that the state appropriates for need-based aid. It's been one of the most kind of rapidly growing programs, really targeted, the program that is targeted towards middle income kind of students and their families. The next area is our career and education outreach programs. And I'm on page 4 now of my slide presentation for those that want to follow up. One of the things that you may not know is that through our success in competing for really 3 federal grants, VSAC provides career and education counseling to first generation and low income students statewide across the state. We've got counselors that work one-on-one with these students in nearly 75 Vermont schools. We're serving about 3,700 middle school and high school students on our particular caseload. And this is, one of the ways that I like to kind of think about this or describe the impact of this work. If I were to ask many of you, if you were not if you'd gone to college, if I were to ask you, when did you know that you were going to go on to pursue education or training after high school? The vast majority of you would probably say some version of I always knew, or I knew at a very early age, in part because of conversations that were happening at school or at home. For first generation students, these conversations normally will not take place because their parents or their guardians don't necessarily have the experience with the post-secondary education system. And part of our mission and role is to facilitate those conversations both at home and in school. And I thought we would share just a little bit of the statistics on the success of these programs. So just looking at high school graduation rates, if we look at free and reduced lunch students, which is a good proxy for the students that we are serving, 85% of them will graduate from high school. If we take a look at those students that are participating in our outreach programs, their high school graduation rates rise to between 96 and 98%. So the support that we're providing is having an immediate impact on their ability to stay in school. From our perspective, just as or more importantly, is their aspiration for post-secondary education or training. So only 46% of students that are free and reduced lunch go on to any form of post-secondary education. But those that are participating in our programs go on at rates that are between 70 and 79%, in both cases higher than the state average. You know, I've been talking a fair amount about kind of education and probably not the training side enough. You know, oftentimes people think that the work that we are doing is solely focused on 2- and 4-year education. But we are really committed as an organization to helping people map whatever career and education or training pathway they need to. So we are providing support to them in pursuing apprenticeships, certificate programs, non-degree programs, and other training programs. We do this for traditional age students, but we also do this for adult students. We've got counselors living and working in every region of the state, working with adults. These are individuals who may have dropped out of high school, generally are 18 years or older, may or may not have had any education or training after high school. Each year, we're able to provide support to about 1,700 adult students. We partner very closely with the Department of Labor, where we in fact co-train our staff so that they are versed both in the programs that are available through DOL, and they are versed in the programs that we offer. 84% of the participants without a high school credential completed their high school credential in participating in this program. 92% of them applied for financial aid. 90% of them applied to a post-secondary education or training program, and 75% of them successfully enrolled in an education or training program after working for us. This program is critically important, not just to us, but it's a significant pipeline for our work with the career and tech education centers, with the state colleges, and with apprenticeship and other education and training programs across the country, across the state. And I'd be glad to kind of provide some additional kind of information about the work that we are doing there. One of the challenges, and I know that this is something that Chairman Campion is greatly familiar with, that I did want to touch on in our work in partnerships, relates to post-secondary graduation and retention rates. One of the major challenges in higher education, if you look across the country, only a little over 50% of the students that start a 4-year degree will graduate and receive that degree within a 6-year period. The rest of those students drop out for one reason or another. And where probably a decade ago, when BSAC thought about its work, our goal and our mission was to get students through high school into the doorstep of education. And I used to joke that when we thought of our traditional age students, we almost felt like we were, kind of parents of students. We would deliver you to the school's doorstep, wave goodbye and say good luck, and hope that we had given you the support that you needed to be successful, and then would rely on the institutions to provide the support. Well, not surprisingly, particularly when you're working with the students that we are working with, this strategy was not one that was necessarily particularly successful. So BSAC was one of the first organizations in the country to apply to the Department of Education, Federal Department of Education, for funding to launch what we refer to as our kind of 6-year program. And essentially, we continue the services that we are providing to students, to them through their first and into their second year of post-secondary education or training, with the goal of increasing their retention rates and ultimately increasing their graduation rates. This is important for a whole variety of reasons. When we talk about student loan debt, and we talk about the students that are struggling with student loan debt, the vast majority of those that are struggling are students that dropped out with loans, but without the economic value of having gotten their degree. And so when we don't take the effort or don't make the effort to make sure that students not just matriculate, but also graduate, we're not doing a significant portion of them, a favor. So using our research arm, and Marilyn will talk a little bit more about this a little bit later on, we started tracking how Vermont students were performing regardless of the institution that they were attending, so that we could partner with institutions to develop programs that would increase retention and graduation rates. And I wanted to share on page 7 of my slides some of the preliminary numbers that we have seen. I mentioned that nationally the average is about 52%. When we look at Vermont free and reduced lunch students that enroll in 2- and 4-year programs, we saw 6-year completion rates for them of about 47.7%. Those that were participating in our guide program, and these are again largely free and reduced lunch eligible students, they're low income first gen, we're able to increase those numbers to 63%. And while we're not satisfied with that as an outcome, it is a significant improvement and something that we think shows promise for additional ways that we can partner with Vermont institutions to increase the retention and graduation rates of their students. So let me pause there and I've covered a lot of ground. I'm going to just touch briefly on our respiration programs and then let Marilyn talk about our financial aid programs. But see if anyone has any questions about what I might have just presented.
Senator Lyons.
I just have a question about your work with DOL and the advising that you give to kids who, may be hesitant about going into college and haven't made that decision. Are the counseling services embedded within the high school, or are they outside in a different environment?
So they're actually in the high school.
I can't hear you, sorry.
They're in the high schools or in the middle schools.
Okay,
So
all right.
our counselors live within regions, and then they have loads in the schools.
What about kids who have graduated? So there are counselors for those folks. Are they also still in the high school, or are they outside?
They're outside. So we have what we call our adult outreach counselors. They live within the regions across the state.
Yep.
And they will, in this environment, everything is remote right now.
Yes.
Ironically, in that particular program is a boon for reasons.
I've got a motor going in the background, so I didn't hear you. Sorry.
Being remote in this environment for the adult community has actually created some new opportunities for us.
Yes.
In the past, and at some point we will go back to this, we would pick easily accessible locations within the community. So we might use a library, we might use a state office, we might be on a CCV campus.
Okay.
A place that's readily accessible and easy for those individuals to meet with the counselor.
Do you link in at all with the Weber program, DCF Weber program for those kids? Or
Yes.
They're young adults, actually. I shouldn't say kids.
Yes, we do. We're actually very closely linked with DCF.
Terrific. Okay, thank you. I personally think it's really critical to keep high school graduates out of the high school for this. Just in terms of their perception of who they are and moving on.
Yeah. So for the adults, those that have graduated, our services are provided within the community in places that are readily accessible.
Senator Hooker.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Giles. I know that VSAC is a very important organization to the state and to the education of our kids, our people. And I'm curious to know, if there was an uptick in people who were coming to you, at the beginning of the pandemic, having lost their jobs, when there were going to be programs that were going to be kind of retrofitted so that they could take part in them rather quickly to perhaps retool or something. And how quickly have you been able to pivot to that so that you can allow these people to access financial aid for such purposes?
It's a fabulous question, Senator Hooker, and we were going to kind of touch on part of this at the end if there was time, but let me just describe 3 things that we did immediately. And then, and Marilyn, feel free to jump in when I miss one of the things. I need to give a shout out to our staff for the velocity with which they responded to COVID. We were beneficiaries last year of CARES Act money that you all appropriated to us through the year to deal with some of these concerns. And I'm going to kind of break it into, I think, 4 buckets that we saw real need. One, immediately there were families that were losing jobs, and so the financial aid that they had applied for and received was no longer adequate to meet their needs because they no longer had those jobs that aid was based on. So Marilyn Cargill and her team immediately, we were able to use a little over $2 million of CARES Act money. And we went out through every channel we had to tell families, if you lost your job, reach out to us to appeal your financial aid. And we simplified the process so that we're able to increase financial aid awards for those students by about $2 million in a very kind of short period of time. The second thing that we did, and this was something that we learned in part from our partnership with CCV. When CCV went remote in March, and remember, they're the institution that is the most remote anyway, one of the things that they discovered was that the students that weren't going to their campuses were choosing to not be remote for a reason. And one of those reasons was probably technology. And so when that group suddenly had to go remote, they reached out, their financial aid director reached out to Marilyn, Joyce reached out to me and said, is there anything that you can do on an emergency basis? Because we've got students without the technology. And Marilyn's team launched very quickly a technology stipend program targeted towards those students so that we could get money, a Chromebook, maybe cover some of the costs associated with Wi-Fi if that was the problem. And then once the pandemic deepened and we had access to CARES Act money, we actually launched a bigger stipend program. And Marilyn, how many stipends were we able to get out? It was
1,450, Scott.
So another, so 1,450 stipends in order to support those students, allowing them to go remote so that we didn't lose students. And then in addition to that, we already had a smaller emergency micro grant program that we had launched that is capped at about $450 to $500. That's designed to pick up. I've lost my job. And all of a sudden now I can't. The car breaks down. Something happens that's about to force me to drop out. We launched that program as well to kind of provide broad-based support. One of the things that I will say that was a challenge with this was on the training side. And it wasn't on the aid delivery side, but many of the what I call the non-degree credential programs, welding and other things that require in-person, weren't able to get up and running uniformly in this environment in which, at least in the early days of the pandemic, it wasn't safe. So there were some challenges for students that were seeking, particularly adults that were seeking some of those training opportunities, in part because it took until this semester for the training programs to be able to safely reopen.
Okay. Thank you. But a follow-up to that, did you have people who hadn't been in programs come to the agency to look for help? And were they able to get it in a timely fashion?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. This turns out, just as an aside, particularly on the adults, we made the move to online very quickly and started offering all of our programming online. And I'm just going to tell one anecdote that I think is pretty typical. We have a counselor adult counselor up in the Northeast Kingdom who is probably our best with veterans. And, it's a wonderful gift for the veterans that are up in the kingdom. And I'm going to pick on her a little bit because technology early on was not her friend. But one of her younger counterparts, colleagues down in the southern part of the state, who had veterans that were looking for help in this environment, said, hey, let's do a Facebook Live interactive kind of program. And they had 40 veterans from around the state participating in it. As she walked them through both VA benefits, VSAC benefits, and then the programs that were available across the state. That's going to be one of the benefits of this COVID environment, is that we found new ways to use technology. And for those who had access to it, we were able to reach many more people. Marilyn, did you want to add to that?
The only thing I wanted to add, I just wanted to put some timing pieces in front of Senator Hooker. So if an applicant comes to us looking for a training program, we don't require them to fill out a FAFSA, because just filling out a FAFSA is a pretty long time frame that it takes to get it filled out and processed and back to VSAC. We have a separate standalone application for training programs. We normally can tell someone within 10 days whether or not they qualify. So we can turn that around in less than 2 weeks for them. And on the emergency grant that Scott spoke of, once a student has been nominated for that grant program and we are notified of it, we normally can actually disperse the money to them within 2 to 3 days. So there's a very quick turnaround time on these programs, especially when we were in the heart of this pandemic and people were pretty desperate for those funds.
Other questions? New senators in particular, does everyone have a good, solid understanding of VSAC? I mean, your funding, Mr. Giles, would you just review with us how that works?
Sure. So we have kind of a mix of funds. We get, started here for a second as I organize it. So I kind of mentioned at the outset the programs that we administer. The bulk of our operational funding or administrative funding comes from the student loan programs that we originate and service. So in that regard, we are a little bit like we're a social enterprise where we offer families kind of low rates, and then we are allowed to keep 2% of the interest that we charge to run our programs. And that money is essentially what runs the full operations of VSAC. For our career and education counseling programs, we have 3 federal grants that we, VSAC, also match, kind of using our own money. Other states would match it. We use our funds for that. And then we receive just around $20 million in funds from the state of Vermont. We're authorized to use a portion of that for administration. At this point in time, we don't. We use loan kind of programs to be able to cover the costs of administering all the programs we described. And 100% of that 20 million ends up in the hands of students, with the exception of a carve out that we have for about $200,000 in these funds that we use for what we call our aspiration initiatives, which are short term. When I say short term, 2 to 3 year programs in counties where the post-secondary education and training going rate of first generation students is dramatically lower than it is for second gen students. We use $200,000 of our appropriation to fund projects designed with those communities to increase the college going rates in those areas. And I'm just mindful of the time that you have given me, and and I would love to spend more time talking about it. These programs have been incredibly successful, and if the committee's interested, I could come back another time to share more detail about that. But I would like to take a minute to talk, Marilyn, talk about our grant programs to give you some color on that, and then share our budget request, particularly with regard to a program we're very excited about, the 802 opportunity.
Sure. And just one final question, if you don't mind. What would, if a senator, who are we directing to you guys? I mean, what kinds of calls? I get a call, for example, from a family that, their son or daughter is looking at a state institution, or they're looking at just filling out the financial aid forms. Are these the kinds of things that you guys can handle? I mean, I'm just trying to think of, constituent services, the kinds of things we should be directing to you if all of a sudden in Rutland County, Senator Hooker or Senator Terenzini get calls. Which ones would they send to you guys?
So look, maybe the best way to describe it is, some of the things that we've gotten recently. But if somebody is struggling with trying to figure out what their future looks like, and they're an adult or they are a student, you can send them to us, for current education counseling. If somebody is struggling with the financing side, they don't understand financial aid, or they're afraid oftentimes that they're going to make a mistake, send them to us. If they are trying to make sense of student loans, because that's a significant part of, the financial aid, the financing process that folks are thinking about, and they want to make sure that they make smart choices, we provide counseling whether they're a customer of ours or not. And then the last thing that I would want to touch on, something that we could spend much more time talking about, is our loan coach kind of program. Most education loans are being made by the Department of Education now. We were a servicer for them. We canceled our contract because we disagreed about the levels of customer service. Our expectations for how you should treat customers were higher dramatically than the department's. And so we canceled our contract, but we still provide loan counseling. So if you have a constituent who's, running into trouble and doesn't know what to do or make sense of it, you can send them, to us. I had a legislator who just recently retired. She probably wouldn't mind if I told this story, who had a student who'd been in foster care, who was doing work for her on her farm over the summer. And she suddenly, she had been talking to this young man about his future, and he was saying all the right things to make it sound as though he was going to be going to school in the fall. Mm-hmm. And 3 weeks beforehand, it became clear to her that he had not done any of the things that needed to be done. And partnering with one of our institutions, we got one of our career and education counselors working with him to figure out what it was that he really wanted. We were able to pull together a financial aid program. We were able to, figure out the scholarship situation, and I got on the phone with 2 presidents to try and make sure that we could find a spot for him, and we're able to get him in. Now, I'm not saying that we can do that, every time, but that captures the full range of, things. This was Kitty. I can share. Kitty Toll picked up the phone and called, and in that, this young man is now ran into some troubles, but is about to graduate from one of our institutions and is looking to pursue a career in human services because he wants to pay his experience forward.
Great. Thank you. Senator Chittenden.
Chair Campion, I just want to recognize that I do have some familiarity with VSAC. Pat LeDuc is a good friend of mine. He lives in South Burlington, CIO of VSAC. And I will say this, in years past, I've flirted with the idea of addressing the portability of VSAC, the concern that's been raised as a perennial issue. But I'll say the recent announcements by the University of Vermont, as well as Castleton, to close and terminate programs like geology further substantiate my strong support for allowing VSAC loans to continue to go to other states, because I'd hate it if a Vermont kid really wants to study geology and doesn't have a choice or an option here in the state to do so. So for whatever that's worth hearing, those recent news articles have solidified my continued support for VSAC options and those funds to go out of state.
Thank you, Senator. And I will add that Patrick runs our career and education outreach programs as well as serving as our CIO. So he knows the stories I'm describing really well. So I will thank you, Pat. I'll share that with him.
Great.
Mr. Chair, if it's okay, may I ask Marilyn to present
Absolutely.
the grant programs just so that you're familiar?
Great. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Senator Campion. So I've got 3 or 4 more programs I just want to mention briefly just to give you an overview of them. So one of the things that Scott mentioned, we received just over $19,978,000 from the Vermont Legislature to run the Vermont state grant programs. We have 4 grant programs that we are running. We have a program for students that want to enroll full-time in a degree program. Those students tend to be what you might think of as more traditionally aged students. Those are your 18 to 24-year-olds. They're more likely to start directly out of high school, although more and more adults are now returning to school on a full-time basis. But that program helps about 7,500 students right now be able to attend full-time. In addition to that, Vermont was one of the very first states to create a part-time program, and we did this many, many, many years ago. And part-time allows students to return to school again in a degree program for anywhere between 3 and 11 credits. So it means that they can, it was especially popular with adult students returning to school, looking to complete those degrees or start their degrees if they hadn't, where they still needed to raise families and continue to work. The third grant program that the state of Vermont has is the Advancement Grant. We were the first state in the nation to create this grant, and this is a training program. So back to some of the questions we had earlier, the Advancement Grant specifically funds training programs for anyone that's interested in receiving a license, a certificate, maybe just a skill. We frequently have people that apply for this program because they're looking for a promotion in the job that they're in, and they're lacking a fundamental skill to be able to do that. And then I won't spend a lot more time on the emergency grant program. That is our newest grant. But a few years ago, we were working with our state post-secondary partners, and they let us know that they were losing students who were dropping out, not because they had a big bill with the school, but because they had encountered a small emergency situation outside of school that they could not get past. And it might be a student who needed snow tires in the winter. And without snow tires, they could not get back and forth to school. So their option would be to stop out. Or a student who had food insecurity and the choice needed to be made about whether to work enough hours to be able to buy food or stay in school. We created the emergency grant program that awards up to $400 to a student in an emergency situation that would cause them to either stop out of school or not be able to return between semesters. This year so far, we have awarded over $107,000 in $400 or less awards. And that is directly related to this pandemic. We have seen more requests this year than we've ever seen for this program. And it's about 2.5 years old, but this has been an unprecedented year for the use of this particular program.
Ms. Cargill, would you remind us, do those dollars need to be paid back?
None of these need to be paid back. These are all grant dollars that
Great.
are gift aid.
Great, thank
Thank
you.
you for asking that. I want to just take a minute to talk about advancement grants a little bit further, because I want to tell you who is using that program. So the advancement grant is the training grant program. It also is used by adults who are interested in going back to college, but they don't know if they can do college level work. They're not confident. And the step between whatever they're doing in their life and applying for admission is that's just way too big a step. And that barrier just shuts them down. So when the state created the advancement grant, they allowed students to use that who were testing academic waters or taking a training program. Right now, the average recipient of our advancement grant is a woman. She's 35 years old. She makes less than $21,000 a year, and she's raising a child. So this is a very targeted program to low-income Vermonters who are either trying to change their employment situation directly through training or going through an education program that ultimately leads them to a new career. The next program I want to talk about just really quickly, VSAC also administers a scholarship program. We have over 120 different scholarships that we administer on behalf of philanthropic groups, private donors, foundations, the state of Vermont, the federal government. Last year, there were over almost 3,500 awards that were made worth $6.1 million. So that also was money that did not have to be repaid for the most part. There are a few scholarships that have service obligations attached to them that we run for the state of Vermont, but for the most part, a scholarship is gift aid that does not have to be repaid. One new scholarship I'll mention quickly just because it's relatively new, not just to VSAC, but it's new across the country. We have a private donor who's really interested in making sure that people who are interested in certificate programs, so those non-degree training programs that result in certificates, have additional funds to help them. So the Hale Foundation, working with the Curtis Fund and partnering with VSAC, has a program that's going right now that's putting $175,000 a year into scholarship money, particularly for students that are looking at credentials of value. So that's just an example of a partnership that we have with a private funder and a philanthropic group, which is really making a big difference because a lot of these training programs can be fairly expensive. They may only be 8 or 9 month programs, but maybe they cost $24,000 or $25,000. You cannot receive the federal loan programs to help offset those costs. There's very little financial aid. There's VSAC's advancement grant that we run for the state of Vermont, and there's a handful, and this is one of the only ones, private scholarships for these students. Aside from that, they've got to come up with the rest of those funds from their family. So it's really important, the work that these funders are doing, trying to find additional support for this type of program, especially as Vermont has realized we need 70% of Vermonters to have some type of education or training beyond high school in order to take the high pay, high demand jobs that are going to be created in Vermont by 25. There's just not going to be a lot of other jobs available. So funding for these types of programs becomes really critical.
May I interrupt for a moment?
Sure.
How would you say most Vermonters reach you, VSAC? I mean, you know, if you were to poll, and I guess the follow-up would be, is enough being done to make certain that if I were to walk down into downtown Bennington, would people in general know that you're all there and you're a resource for them and for their children?
Great question, Senator Campion. You know, this is a question that I think no matter how much you're doing, you could always do more. But I will say this, when we run, and we haven't done one for a few years, but we were part of a poll a few years ago, just trying to understand name recognition. What was the name recognition of Vermont, of VSAC within the state of Vermont? And Scott, correct me, Scott just moved into my screen. Scott, I believe we were somewhere north of 90% of name recognition. Is that right?
That was aided name recognition, but in the 80 to 82%. The challenge, Senator Campion, is people will know specific programs, but not the full range of services. Mm-hmm. So in the high schools, in the school setting, the school counselors and teachers do a lot of the referrals. And those relationships are kind of very close.
So if you were to walk into Rutland High School and talk to the guidance counselors, they are going to know.
Oh, instantly.
Okay.
And at the adult level, this is where what we do is we partner with all of the groups. We try and partner with all of the groups that are supporting the adult community.
Yeah.
And the challenge there, in part, particularly, and I'll say this with young men, is that once they graduate from high school, we lose access to them.
Yeah.
Something happens in their life, lost a job, discovered that you didn't, you couldn't earn, a decent living with what you had, or something more dramatic. And so, that's an example of an area where there's, I think, work that all of us within the community need to do more of.
Thank you.
The last program I just want to mention briefly, and I won't say much more than what Scott has already said. VSAC does run loan programs. We both service and originate loans from VSAC. These are low interest loans. We work really hard to ensure that we have a really good loan product to be able to offer to Vermont families. And for a number of families, even once they've gotten all their financial aid and their federal Stafford loans or direct loans for their student, which we encourage students to always look at, there's a gap. And that's where VSAC's non-federal loans come into play. So we do offer those programs. And I think one of the most important parts of those programs, which Scott also mentioned, is the counseling that we can provide. And we provide that counseling whether or not that student ends up borrowing from us. So if you have a constituent who is having trouble with a student loan, that is a perfect referral to VSAC, and we handle those calls all the time. Our counselors will even do a three-way call with that borrower, that former student, to try to help them in those repayment situations. Because if any of you have used the student loan programs, these are complex programs, and unfortunately, probably more complex than they need to be, but they're really difficult for families to try to navigate on their own. The very last program I want to mention before we get to VSAC's funding request for this year is our research program. And I am on slide 14. There's links on that slide to a number of different research documents that VSAC has created that you might be interested in. I want to talk about two of them today and let you just explore the rest at your leisure. One of them that you might be interested in looking at, there's at the very bottom, it says fiscal year 20 county facts. Those are documents for each of you that show you a lot about your own county. There's information about the affordability of higher education for your county, the number of students you have that receive financial aid from VSAC, the education of your population. So lots of good information on that county sheet. And I certainly would say it's probably worth taking a quick look at as you are considering anything to do with higher ed and your own community. The other thing we did this year that is a slightly different survey than we've ever done before. VSAC really wanted to understand how COVID-19 impacted Vermont students and their college-going plans. Every student in Vermont who applies for financial aid fills out the FAFSA document. Those come to VSAC. We use that information to survey those students to make sure whether or not they were still planning to go to school and what financial impacts they had seen. There's a lot of interesting information. We divided them into 3 cohorts. One survey was done in the May-June timeframe, one in July, August, and we just are completing one right now to see who's returning for the spring semester. This was eye-opening. 6 out of 10 and 7 out of 10 on the first 2 surveys, number of families said they were directly impacted by COVID, whether they lost their job, their parent lost their job, they couldn't find summer employment. Some students lost certain types of financial aid because it was contingent on them doing certain things that they couldn't do because the COVID shut down their school in a way that didn't allow it. It was really powerful to see the impact that COVID had across the state of Vermont. Scott, was there anything else on the research side that you wanted to be sure to call out?
No, other than just to share that, as you said, aligned with Senator Campion's question, if you've got questions about higher ed data, on the access and affordability side, don't hesitate to reach out. We've got a small unit that does this work, and we consider it part of our mission to provide support to the legislature in this regard. Marilyn, do you want to just jump right into our request really quickly?
I certainly can. So one of the things that we looked at this year, we're asking for level funding for the state grant program, so the 19.978 million. But in addition to that, we have 3 additional asks. And one of them is a new program that we're calling 802 Opportunity. And I just want to set the table a little bit for that request. When we do our studies in Vermont, one of the things we're looking at is we compare how Vermont does against the nation in a number of different areas. When we look at 4-year high school, college enrollment at 2- and 4-year schools, we find that in Vermont, 55% of students go on to enroll in 4-year institutions, which far outperforms the national average. At the national average, 44% of students go on to 4-year schools. So we are definitely doing well in getting students to consider 4-year institutions. Where we aren't doing as well is 2-year institutions. Nationally, 26% of the nation looks at 2-year schools, enrolls in 2-year schools. In Vermont, that's only 7%. So the very first request that we are making this year is for an increase of $1.9 million in funding so that we can make CCV tuition free for families that make $50,000 or less. And so this is a way to go back to some of the things I heard you talking about earlier today with Senator Hardy and others, that when the message is incredibly clear, when the McClure Foundation said, if you graduated from high school and you are eligible to take 1 free course at CCV, they saw a real response from students. They understood exactly what they were eligible for. We are trying to make something equally clear here to be able to say if your family makes $50,000 or less between the federal Pell Grant and the VSAC grant, you could attend CCV tuition free. And we believe that that will be about $1.9 million to be able to make that happen. The second part of our request is $500,000 additional dollars for the advancement grant. And that's that training program that we talked quite extensively about that's targeted to low-income adult students in Vermont. And the third prong of this request is $300,000 for the aspiration program that Scott described. And what we're looking for here, right now we have a carve out that we take out of our state grant program to pay for that. We're asking it to be a standalone appropriation so that we don't have to reduce state grants by the $200,000 that's currently being used. So there's both a slight increase in funding and a request that it be a standalone appropriation. The final thing we're asking for, and this isn't money that comes directly to VSAC, but VSAC also runs a dual enrollment stipend program. And what that is a stipend for books and supplies. So the Department of Education runs the dual enrollment and early college voucher program. That is what allows high school students to take college level courses in the dual enrollment program, and a high school student to complete their high school senior year and their freshman college year at the same time. When this program first launched, there was an understanding pretty quickly that it was being underutilized by low-income families because while tuition was free, books were not free, transportation was not free. If there were any fees, those were not free, nor supplies. So the stipend was created so that low-income families, and this is defined in dual enrollment by being on free and reduced hot lunch, would receive a stipend to offset some of those expenses. That stipend has increased steadily over the years. This past year, it was 85,000 originally. It had a very, very modest decrease in it due to the budget adjustment that occurred. And we are asking that that be level funded at 85,000 going forward.
May I ask a quick question? Why $50,000 for a household income? Just tell us a bit about where that number came from.
Sure. Well, I probably jumped over the headline, and I'm thinking Scott, if he was closer to me, would be kicking me under the table. We currently have, the way our grant system is set up right now for CCV, a family of 4 making about $30,000 can already attend CCV tuition free when we combine their VSAC grant and their Pell grant. And the reason for that is a family making about $30,000 has a 0 family contribution. So their Pell and VSAC would cover their full tuition. We were just looking to push that number up. And
Right.
we were trying also, I think, just to be fiscally responsible with what was going on in the state. So we just said, what would the next step? If we tried to take it to the next step, what might that look like and what might that cost?
But could this be a husband and wife with 1 child?
You know, yes. Right now.
Okay, so right now it's just 2 people. That child, let's say, Bob and Sally have Bob Jr. Bob Jr. They're making 50,000 or less, can go for free.
Would be able to go to CCV between their Pell grant and their VSAC grant tuition free.
Okay. Other questions, committee? Please, Senator Perchlik.
On the aspiration grant program, I noticed that the participating schools, which I don't want to jinx myself and say it's a problem, but 3 of the 4 were in Washington County and the other one was Hardwick, which is sort of just close to Washington County. I wondered why that was.
Yeah, we rotate them around. So this is kind of the new group. And there are 2 things that we take a look at because we've been up in the Kingdom, we've been down in Bellows Falls, and we have been in Rutland County. And the criteria is the gap between first and second generation kind of aspiration rates and the desire and capacity of that institution at this point in time to take this on. So because it's a partnership, we are also looking for schools that are, who say, yes, this is a priority for us right now. And then our goal is to spend 2 to 3 years there with them, build the things that they need so that they can then run them on their own. And then we move on to the next communities. They're waiting. But we are always looking, it is a combination of the numbers and the commitment of the institution. And so we are always looking for schools that would like to tackle this.
Great. And Jared, can I do a second unrelated question?
Absolutely.
And that is about the portability. What is VSAC say on that portability? I remember from last year that you guys support it. Maybe it's obvious, but what do you say to those that suggest that we shouldn't be the only state that allows it?
I think that there are really kind of 2 prongs to our thinking about portability, and we're not the only state. There are other states that are that we have relationships with that also allow their grants to come here. But that, to our mind, is a little bit beside the point. That's not the core of this. There are really 2 prongs. So one is a practical concern, and one is a social justice concern. So these grants, the grants in the Vermont State Grant Program are more targeted from a financial perspective than nearly any program in the country. And the equity issue that lies behind the creation of that program was a belief that first generation and low income students should have access to the full range of education and training opportunities that they need without regard to their financial needs or financial needs. So I would start with there's a social justice question embedded here. There's also a practical one that Senator Chittenden touched on part of it. And that is that, for some students, particularly those that are in the border counties and in the southern part of the state, the nearest institution is across the border. And for those students for whom kind of access to a family or community support system is critical to their being able to pursue their educations, portability allows them to continue to get their education while staying connected with the support structure. And so that's kind of one piece of it. The other things that we see on the practical side is that Vermont does not offer every program that students want or need. And if I were to turn to the New England Board of Higher Education, just as an example, and this is before the decisions that our institutions have made recently, about programs, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of programs that are not available in Vermont. And some of those programs are critically important from an economic perspective. That portability allows low-income students access to those programs much the way they would students who have access to have greater resources. And then the other part, even for those programs that are available within the state, and I'll use nursing as a great example. Just because we have a program here doesn't mean that you get admitted to the four-year program in Vermont. They're very competitive. And we run into a number of students, low-income students, who are not admitted to the Vermont program, but will attend a program, outside the state, and will obtain their nursing credential and then come back home because this is where they want to be. So, I think our general response has those two prongs. It's social justice at the heart of it, and then practical concerns for many of our students.
Senator Lyon.
Yes, thank you. So as you're talking, I'm thinking, is it possible at all to have some return requirements attached to the loans when students take them out of state? So can we say if we provide this nursing scholarship for you or this nursing loan for you, and you go out of state, then we would expect you to at least apply for a job in the state? Is there any kind of hook we can put in to get? I'm thinking you brought up nurses, and that's a huge workforce need right now.
And I think that there are other more direct ways to deal with things directly like nursing. We would not support a kind of proposal like that. And the question I would ask, would we require students that go to one of our public institutions in Vermont to be required to remain in the state or have to pay back a portion of their kind of the tuition that they received as a result of it? Having said that, in targeted areas like nursing, which I leaned into on purpose, and Marilyn probably wants to kind of jump out of her chair right now. There, we VSAC are also administering on behalf of the state some very specific workforce programs that provide loan forgiveness and or repayable scholarship aid that is targeted directly to those programs. And I know you're very familiar with them as having promoted these programs. Marilyn knows far more than I do about the actual administration. But in some targeted places, I think that is, that's appropriate. I keep going back to, and I'm going to go back to, our numbers here. When we take a look at the grant program and we take a look at the migration of young people, 50% of high school, roughly 50% of high school seniors will choose to attend an institution out of state, but less than 30% of grant recipients. And in part of that, it's because of affordability issues, even given the other constraints that they face. And the question that I have for myself, and I close maybe with stories are more powerful. Who are these people that we are talking about? There was a young woman I met 2 years ago when I could actually go to one of our live events from down We were outside of Castlefin. And I think she captures for me the social justice question that I am wrestling with. When I met her, she'd been in one of our outreach programs for since she was in middle school. The really telling part, though, was the conversation with her mother. So this was a young woman who was going to one of our college preparation programs, when we held them on weekends. And students are normally dragged to these, but this was a young woman who was just so excited and, came bounding up to me with her mother. So her mother's story was the really telling one. So her mother had been a 4.0 student, graduated number 2 in her class. And the day after she graduated from high school, her parents moved to Florida and basically said, you're on your own. And she never thought that she had any opportunity. So she didn't. She worked as a waitress for a number of years. Ended up getting pregnant, having a child. And then ended up having a second child with significant disability. And so she has been a single mom supporting these 2 children. And it wasn't until her daughter joined one of our outreach programs that she knew that there were opportunities for children like hers. And this young woman is, her daughter is following in her mother's footsteps in the academic sense. Is doing everything right. She's got a 4.0, and she dreams of, kind of pursuing a medical degree that will allow her to kind of be able to essentially take care of and care for other young people like her brother. And for her, because her mother needs her to be able to continue to be able to support her brother, she's looking at a school that is right across the border because it will allow her to go to school and come home every night while her mother's working to be able to take care of her. But, my children did not have to bear that kind of a burden. And from a social justice perspective, I don't know why she should have to.
I apologize, Senator Perchlik. I skipped over you before when your hand was up. Please go ahead.
Oh, that's fine. Well, just in response to that story, which is a touching story, which I think is the reason why we would want to at least keep the border closeness kind of, we talked about with Senator Polina, one point one of his bill said that the portability would continue if they're close. But there are also stories of students that because of the lack of funding can't go to school. So you can look at it from both sides, that there's, because of the lack of funds and the expense of going to Northern Vermont University, they're not going. And could that money had stayed in the state allowed them to go? That's the other side of the question. And I wondered if you could send me I didn't see it on the presentation, the grant programs criteria, what the income criteria is to get a grant, not just the portability, because I assume it's the same whether it's you're leaving the state or not. But if you could send what the income qualifications are, that would be interesting.
Yeah, no, and we would be glad, Senator, to set up a time if it would be useful for you to have a more complete conversation about this and provide data and criteria, or come back if the committee would like a more complete presentation. We'd be glad to walk through that. A couple observations I would make. I mean, I hear your points. One, the choice that you're giving me is picking between my low-income students and saying which ones are worthy of our support and which ones, are not. But I will say that there are some misconceptions about the grant program and the way it's administered, which suggests that somehow, if we were to eliminate portability, there would suddenly be money available, that students that are not able to access any grants at all would somehow now be eligible for accessing grants. Many, many other states across the country, and we've tried to correct this, operate on a first come, first served basis for grants. And so there's a cutoff. VSAC does not. We use a projection model because we know first-gen low-income students, particularly adults, make their decisions late. And so we do our modeling in order to try and keep the grant application open well into the second semester. So the idea that there is somebody that is not getting access to a grant because of this, could we be adjusting levels? That's a different conversation, but there's nobody that's being shut out because of portability.
Right, but there would be more money available. So like you could take money from the portability and move it to your 802 opportunity grant.
You could take money from one group of low-income students to decide that you wanted to give them to.
Terrific. Great discussion. This is certainly something that we're going to talk about a little bit, continue this conversation a little bit later this evening, this afternoon. And I think it'll be ongoing. How can we, again, give, and by the conversation, how can we give people more access? Is it through the CCV proposal that you all just put forward, or is another model? And it's certainly going to be, it's an important and large question. Okay, Senator Hooker, please.
Thank you. Just before we leave the portability discussion, I'm curious to know about other states that have reciprocity with Vermont, and how many of those are there?
We can pull those numbers and we can share them with the full committee.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, the observation that I would make was that we were one of the first in the country to establish equity as one of the core kind of values behind our grant program. And over time, in the early days, many states have kind of followed us. And then in recent, some states like New Hampshire eliminated the grant program altogether. And while reciprocity is important, I think that our state's long-term commitment to equity is really what drives and lies at the heart of this particular program. So we're glad to share all of that, but I'm not hanging my hat on that. Having said that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you both.
And I really appreciate both the questions. I appreciate your commitment to creating opportunity for students. I hope that you got a sense both for the scope of our programs and our passion. As I say to my team, some days it's just one student at a time in the work that we're doing. And the conversations that we're having about expanding access opportunities can have a really meaningful impact. So thank you for taking a look at our programs.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Committee, let's just take a quick stretch, come back at 4:05. We have two more witnesses that we'll hear from together, and then a little committee discussion. Senator Lyons will be back. Senator Terenzini had an appointment, but we still have a quorum and can move forward. So just 4:05, we'll get back at it. Thanks. Catherine Levasseur, good to see you. And Sharon Scott, great to see you. You can tell I'm working on every morning when I get up, I do a French exercise that the French newspaper Le Monde sends me. And so I'm trying to get my French back up to speed, just in case, it's possible to travel somewhere this summer.
WCAF reports they might be reopening the border to Canada in a couple of months. So keep practicing, Chair.
Keep practicing. Great. Thank you both for being with us. And I apologize. We'd hoped to have you a little bit earlier, but as you know, this is the way of the legislature. We get into good conversations. I asked the two of you here, as you know, to give us a sense of what you're seeing on the ground at state colleges and CCV. And I know we should be talking about them. They are really one thing, but in some ways, they also are different in terms of their programs and who accesses them and what they offer. But what I'm wondering is, what is the financial situation out there for students when they graduate, when they might just take a few classes? What kind of debt are students graduating with? Or even students that, again, aren't graduating, you know, they enroll at, I don't know, let's just say Northern University, they take a few classes, realize it's not for them, maybe take a term, you know, they're carrying a debt load. Just hoping you can give us a picture of what you're seeing out there statewide as we look to give people more access. And I should say, I keep talking about access, and one of the things I keep reminding myself but not saying aloud is access to what? I mean, we want, of course, good programs that match our student needs. But for now, let's just talk about the access to those programs.
Well, thank you so much for having us here. My name is Sharon Scott, and I am the Chief Financial and Operating Officer for the Vermont State Colleges. And with me today, as you know, I have Catherine, who is our Director of External Relations and Government Affairs, and we are very happy to have her. As you all know, the Vermont State Colleges are the 4 colleges of the state of Vermont, 4 Vermont State Colleges: Community College of Vermont, Castleton University, Northern Vermont University, and Vermont Tech. And we appreciate you asking us very specifically about the pricing and the financial conditions that our students are facing today. So beginning on the first page of your packet, we wanted to highlight the net price for our students for first-time, full-time Vermonters. This is from the 2018-19 academic year. And our price ranged pretty significantly, as you can see. Community College of Vermont obviously has the lowest price at around $10,500, and Vermont Tech at about $20,500. The rate varies largely due to the type of program offered, the teaching modality, whether there are residential offerings. And for example, CCV naturally has that lowest price for first-time, full-time Vermonters, as these students have the lowest tuition at that institution, and they generally commute from home. By contrast, Vermont Tech, on the other hand, has the highest net price for Vermonters. Their programs are more expensive to operate. There are significantly greater equipment needs, and they necessitate an overall higher price, plus the residential offerings, though the Williston offerings do not necessarily require students to live on campus.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, if I may.
Sure.
Please, committee members, feel free to do the same. But just so I have a clear picture of what I'm looking at, none of these dollar amounts have students taking out any student loan. This is where we're at with grants that do not need to be paid back.
This is the net price to a student, inclusive of all forms of payment. So whether that is gifts or grants or other aid.
Including money that
So it's tuition and fees and living expenses, books, materials, all sorts of things that go along with an individual's net price.
Okay. So is this, so I'm just looking here, in-state, first-time, full-time students who receive grant aid, do these numbers have aid in them?
My understanding is that these do not have aid. Now, it's the average. So we have many Vermont students who live at home, who have a significantly lower cost of attendance, because the commuting cost of attendance is quite a bit lower than for a Vermont student who, for example, is living in the residence halls.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Chittenden, please.
Did I just hear you say this includes your bundling in residential life? So housing is bundled into this average? You haven't split out housing as a separate thing to study? Or
housing is not split out from this. The average tuition, or the tuition for NVU for a full year in the 2018-19 year, was around $10,000 just for the tuition.
Okay.
I'd love to see these numbers where you separate out housing entirely, just so we get a good idea of being able to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. And I'm not as familiar with how the Vermont State Colleges requires how much of your funding is part of housing as opposed to allowing students to live in the communities that they're residing.
So our first and second year students, unless they live within a commuting range of 30 miles for Castleton, Northern Vermont University, and Vermont Tech, are required to live on campus if you're a first or second year student. However, if you do live within that commuting range, we have many students, in fact, the majority of students in that commuting range do choose to live at home rather than on campus. Simply, it's a lot less expensive, and it's easier overall to be able to afford their education. And affordability is of prime importance to us. I absolutely think breaking that out for you so that you understand the difference between the average cost of tuition and mandatory fees, books, and then room and board or housing allowance. So there are still housing expenses associated with being a commuting student as well. For example, they may need to have a car to be able to commute back and forth to school. On the next slide, we show the average aid that is provided to students. So while the first slide showed the net price, the next slide shows you the net aid or the average aid in various categories. This first slide is for gift aid. So aid that students do not have to pay back. Any grant aid is across the top. And then federal aid, state and local governmental aid, and then institutional grants. The federal Pell and other federal amounts, as you can see, are largely the same across institutions. There is some variability depending on institutional programs that are available at each of our institutions. For example, federal work-study programs or supplemental educational opportunity grants. Those are opportunities that are there for additional aid, but they are variable by institution. That's why you'll see some variable amounts. The next is state and local government. That is our VSAC grants largely, although there are some local grants elsewhere. And again, you can see that the amounts are relatively the same across institutions, and that's based on VSAC's Vermont grant allocation methodology, which I heard Scott talking about earlier this afternoon. The last category are institutional grants, and those grants are grants that are related to institutional aid that's being provided by the institutions. So they would be what some might refer to as discounts regarding attendance. And you can see that those do vary quite substantially by institution. CCVs are obviously quite a bit lower, and Castleton, NVU, and VTC have higher amounts.
So another way to say this is that, CCV, let's just use discount rate. Their average discount rate is $421.
For a first-time, full-time Vermonter, yes.
Okay. Would you go back to the first slide for a moment?
Mm-hmm.
And I apologize, this could just be, I think as the chair, sometimes you're supposed to maybe pretend and that you understand it all. But where I'm seeing average, average net price. Why are you using the word average there? I mean, is that because this does? So if I open up the CCV if I've got a kid and I open up the Castleton State University brochure and I point that $17,641 is going to be in the catalog, or is that the average because you are reducing it with grant aid?
No, this is the average for the students who are enrolled in the 2018-2019 year, depending on whether that student lived on campus or did not live on campus. So, for example, I think I mentioned that I'll choose NVU because I'm a little more familiar with their particular pricing from this time frame. Approximately $10,500 for their tuition, and approximately $10,000 for living on campus between room and board combined. When you look at a commuting student, a commuting student's living allowance is quite a bit lower than $10,000. And so that would lower, for the proportion of students who are commuting, that lowers the average. So it isn't the sticker price that you would see for just an average student, though it is, it would be close, but we would point to, if you intend to live on campus, here's your tuition, mandatory fees, room and board. If you intend to live remotely or live with your parents, which is what a commuting student is doing,
Right.
here's what that sticker price would look like prior to any
Yeah.
gift or grant aid.
Yeah, I think Senator Chittenden's point about just pulling those apart at some point would be really helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So moving to the next slide, this is an outline of loans that were received for our students for this same period of time. As you can see, the loans, federal loans, don't vary widely between Castleton, NVU, and VTC, though there is a proportional difference depending on those students who have access to certain types of federal loans based on income eligibility and EFC calculation. So for example, NVU has more Pell eligible students than its two sister institutions at Castleton and Vermont Tech, which would give them a little more federal loan eligibility for the students enrolled in those programs. Other loans, by the same token, if you have greater access to federal loans, your other loans might be less, as well as your other loans may be less if your families may be able to contribute more. Though for the vast majority of our students, they are lower income, and many of them are first generation.
And Ms. Scott, what is Pell eligible now? What qualifies a family or a child? What kind of income?
So I would have to go back and get the answer to that question. I don't want to quote, but I do see that Marilyn and Scott are here. They might have that off the top of their head.
That's okay. Thank you.
Okay. But we can certainly get back to you on that. They are the lowest income students. So it's generally an expected family contribution of between 0, which are the lowest income students, to somewhere around $5,500, $6,000. I'd have to go back and get the exact amount. Next is the median debt that our students carry. Most importantly, when looking at this, is what does the average indebtedness look like for our students who are graduating or who are leaving us without having graduated? Of major concern to the Vermont State Colleges is the amount of indebtedness that our students leave with who withdraw from the Vermont State Colleges without receiving a credential of value. That is one reason why the VSC has been working very hard in the last couple of years to develop off-ramps that allow students to be able to leave the VSC early with some type of credential of value. So for example, in many instances, we've developed associate's degree programs that a student can leave with if they decide that they need to leave us early. So for example, in psychology, there's now a psychology's associate's degree that our students at Castleton and NVU can have access to in order to be able to leave with a credential. The same is true at VTC with the way that their nursing program is designed, that there are multiple points at which a student can complete their degree or a portion of the degree and leave with a credential that will allow them to be able to have access to a better job and a better life to be able to pay off any student loans that they have. You can see that CCV and VTC obviously have lower loan indebtedness as largely 2-year programs, and that it's a little more than twice that for Castleton and NVU. The next chart is loan indebtedness by family income. You can see that there's a pretty wide range of that, but you can see that the $0 to $30,000 range has the largest loan indebtedness across all categories. It does vary a little bit more between the $30,000 and $75,000 range, and then certainly the $75,000 plus. But it is, it's always hard for us when we see larger loan indebtedness for students who are in those lower income bands, particularly in that $0 to $30,000 range. The next is loan indebtedness by Pell eligibility and first generation status. A first generation student is a student who has enrolled with us, whose parents have not attended college or not completed college. And you can see that in general, that for Pell recipients, the loan indebtedness is quite a bit higher. And then for first generation students, it's not universally higher depending on which institutions the student attended. And those are the slides that we have, and we're available to take any questions you may have.
Thank you. Committee, questions? Senator Lyons.
So I'm just wondering what your thinking is around trying to reduce the indebtedness for the lower income folks. And it is concerning to see that. So what thinking have you been putting into this? Or
Absolutely. So first of all, affordability is a prime strategic objective of the Vermont State Colleges. Our Board of Trustees recently affirmed that this past fall as part of their strategic priority setting process. And one of the things that we are doing is trying to look for ways to be able to reduce the cost of attendance overall for all students, but that helps our students at the lowest incomes the most. So some quick and easy things that we are really working on right now is to work with providing open educational resources. I'm for many of you who attended college, whether it was last year or it was 30 years ago, textbooks have not come down in price. My son is in college right now. A math textbook for him just recently was $500, and open educational resource is free. So we are working to try and introduce that, and we have a prime activity that we're doing with faculty right now to try and help them figure out how to introduce open educational resources into their programs in order to be able to reduce the cost of attendance for students. Additionally, our institutions are looking, specifically Castleton and NVU, as part of their financial aid modeling process for the upcoming year, to look at, really look very closely at financial aid modeling that supports our lower income students, and really look at need-based aid as an important value in addition to merit-based scholarships. That's something that hadn't really been done at our institutions until the last 2 or 3 years. And one of the reasons why you're not seeing it in the data, because it takes several years for that data to build.
thank you.
Other questions? This is very helpful. I appreciate it. I appreciate you taking the time. I appreciate you compiling the numbers. We look forward to continuing to work with you. I think we all share the same goal of working to reduce indebtedness of starting with our lowest income Vermonters.
Absolutely. It is a major goal of the Vermont State Colleges.
And it's just disappointing. You hear that trying to find ways, these little ways here and there for young people to save some money, and it's just, it's pretty heartbreaking, the seriousness of this and the difference between a young person who can leave an institution with no debt and start a life and do what he or she wants, compared to somebody that's leaving with $30,000 to $50,000 or more $1,000. And I feel it's bad for the country. I mean, it seems to stifle creativity. You could have very talented, the most talented young people in America leaving with significant debt, and they can't put that creative energy into things as others might be able to, because they're out there getting the job, whatever that is, to pay the bills, to pay the rent, and get a car and have, this on top of it. So appreciate your efforts, and great that you were able to come in today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us, and we look forward to further conversation, and we will provide you with the additional information that you've requested.
And Ms. Scott, for what it's worth, you have the best, whatever that microphone system is that you have, we should get it for all of our witnesses. It is crystal clear.
Well, I am very grateful. It is a wonderful Microsoft headset, and it's the only one that I found that works for me.
Great. Yes, Senator, please.
If you are going to come back with some more data, another thing I'd love to get, and you probably already have it, and I'm the new guy, I'm going to keep saying I'm the new guy for another month or so. I would love to expound upon or go deeper into when you said your 4-year graduation rate and your departures, students that aren't completing their degrees. I'd love to know for each programs, how many of them aren't completing their degrees, and if you have any type of exit interviews as to what the reasons why and what they're doing afterwards, just to get a better idea of why they're not completing those degrees. I'm interested in finding other ways to try to keep them in the program, to finish their degrees, rather than giving them that off ramp causes me pause, because that's going to make it easy, especially when things get challenging. So I'd love to better understand why the students aren't completing their degrees in the NBU system, Castleton, and elsewhere.
That is of critical importance to us as we move forward. Persistence to graduation. The end goal is always graduation. That's where we want them to get to. We want them to come in with the program that they're interested in, and maybe even change it 2 or 3 times like so many of us did, but to leave with the credential that they were hoping to. You came in looking for a bachelor's and you leaving with a bachelor's, or an associate's and you leave with an associate's. But we do know that life gets in the way, and our students are complicated. They are first generation, they're low income, they are often housing insecure or family insecure. And those are things that do get in our way. But we have been spending across our institutions a long time trying to figure that out. And 2 of our institutions, Castleton and NBU, have Title III Strengthening Institution grants, which are really focused on both of those items right now. And so we will get back to you with further information.
Thank you both.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
So committee, to quote Ann Cummings, Senator Cummings, what's your pleasure on this? I mean, what direction should we move in? What would you like to do around this? I mean, we can send a range of bills, range of ideas down to appropriations. I'm going to talk to Senator Kitchell this weekend if I don't reach her tonight, to get a sense of their thinking, but I know that they will look to us to get a sense of what we would like to do. And it seems to me to make sense for us to send something as a committee bill, as a group, or use one of the vehicles that we have. Senator Perchlik.
Well, I see it kind of 2 different issues, which I don't know if we want to try to combine them. And one is about state colleges and the status there and how we can help make the state colleges more sustainable. And then there's ways to make college more affordable in general, some kind of tuition program. I liked the 802 Opportunities program as far as a name and general guidance. I think, as high as we could go would be better for me as far as money. I know last year the chair had kind of given us a dollar amount, and maybe that was based on a conversation he had with the chair of appropriations. So, their program, I think, was 1.9 million for those families that are 50,000 and under. Senator Hardy's bill goes up to 100,000 and is whatever it was, 5 or 6 million together with the counselor. So that would be my goal, is to try to get something out that we have some kind of Vermont program like the 802 Opportunity program.
Yeah, Senator Lyons.
Yes, I think those are great ideas. And I'm wondering if rather than sending a bill, if we could start out with a list of recommendations, whether they go into a bill or not, I don't know. But by the time they get to appropriations, that's all going to shift around. But I'm thinking the VSAC ask is certainly something to start with in terms of the 1.9 million and then the 300,000 or whatever else was there. And then look at some of the other areas that Andy was just Senator Perchlik was just talking about. Sorry, and make a list for ourselves, and then look at, are there conditions around the list? So how is it related to workforce development? Because I know that our committee did this last year, and it was extremely helpful. Or I forgot when, because we're in COVID, but it was extremely helpful just to get some policy parameters around the requests that we're making. It may well be that both the bills that we have in our committee fit the bill. So I think some kind of going through the information we've just heard, is including the bills, because I'm certainly not ready to make recommendations right now, but I think then putting together our committee list, our committee recommendation, and then however you think best to handle this, whether through a bill or ultimately a bill and a letter, or a letter, I think that's decision to be made.
Yeah, and I'm mixed on that, and we'll consult all of you. I just want to go back before hearing from Senator Chinden. So are you looking right now, Senator Lyons, and I think the direction you're going is a really good one, a list of let's say we were to start with the VSAC options, sort of put them down. Let's take a look at them as a group and maybe put, if you will, either make some decisions. Do we increase? Do we lower? What are the parameters we might put around each of these things?
That's basically it. And I think that might help us do a little brainstorming along the way. Sometimes you get tied into proposed legislation and it ends your thinking. But
yeah. No, I think that's
not that the bills are not good. I'm not saying that.
No, but this is a good way to start, and then we can decide the only thing one of the reasons I like sending them a bill in the end, but I do think this is a better way to start, is maybe it'll give Vermonters and others just a moment of pause and say, okay, the legislature is taking this particular step as it relates to this, to kind of pull it out of some of the normal budget discussions, if you will.
Yeah, sure. I agree. A bill is a good idea. No question there.
But I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. This is the way to start. And, I think it's great. Senator Chittenden.
I'm not sure I completely understand the trade-offs here, but I will say this, and it piggybacks off what Senator Lyons just stated, and I think what I heard Senator Perchlik say. As I look at S29, the pause I have on it is it calls for $400,000 on top of the $6 million to go to the VSC to support mentoring, academic support, and needs of additional assistance. It is unclear to me if that is just redundant to what the VSAC's already baked in services provide. And if so I would too am leaning towards the VSAC proposal as if it's an either or, because I know money doesn't grow on trees. It just seems like channeling this support through VSAC makes more sense than redundantly having the Vermont State Colleges stand up $400,000 worth of staff support to provision out $6 million. But I'm not nearly as familiar with this as all of you are.
Well, you're the new guy.
I'm going to say that for a month.
But no, I think what I like about Senator Lyons' idea a lot is I take her point where sometimes when you do look at a bill, you're just not, you're so focused on this. But if we take just the bare bones of what VSAC is saying, put it in a list, and then we can add and subtract as a committee, sort of just, then we have the other bills, we know, and we have those things. But I think Senator Lyons' idea is a good one. And I think it's going to prove to be actually, and this is why I work so hard to get her on the committee.
You're responsible.
But seriously, I think it's a great tool. And just when she said that, I did think, when you're looking at a bill, you just sometimes can get so caught up in it and not sort of jump out. So I'll ask Jim, or I can, depending on his schedule, just pull all this stuff together and share it with folks. And then we'll continue to have this conversation and just look at it all together. And then knowing the other bills are out there, we can add and subtract and come up with something. Senator Perchlik, you look concerned or mad.
No, I'm just staring at my screen. But I had a question, because we don't, in the Education Committee, we don't really have a responsibility to VSAC's budget request. Like, that's obviously going to be an appropriations issue. So, right. I mean, we could send a letter saying we like it, but, we as a policy. But yeah, I do like the idea of listing out what our priorities are for, this bill. And we could take one of the other vehicles, we could, as a since it already has a bill number, but we could also do it as a separate committee bill.
Well, the way I look at the VSAC request is it the same as another request, or would the other request add to it in some way? How would they be integrated? I don't know the answer to all that. And, every idea right now to promote educational opportunities and reduce debt later on is a good idea. Yeah. Then once we have a list, we can start thinking, what are the really good ideas, and put it in a bill. And Senator Campion can talk with Senator Kitchell, and we can figure out where we're going to land.
And so then I had my other question, which I think is for you, Mr. Chair, is do you see the Education Committee working on the larger Vermont State College issue, like recommendations that come out from the Select Committee about merging the campuses, for example? Would that be a bill that would come from our committee, or is that going to be dealt with kind of at a different level, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a great question. I just want to go back to your first comment first, and as it relates to appropriations and VSAC, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, they will do the money piece, but I think our colleagues, and I could be wrong, but I'm getting a sense of this already, will look to us and say, basically, is this a good idea? Has Ed done its due diligence as it relates to, does the Education Committee believe that it warrants these kinds of funds? So in that way, I like, and where those funds might go. So in that way, I would like to, start, as Senator Lyons mentioned, and see what we get. With regard to the Select Committee on Higher Education, again, I think, like, I'm just thinking of Sears, for example. He's going to ask, what do you guys think? He's going to say, hey, have you guys seen this? And I think other colleagues will as well, just so that we can respond. We're the policy committee and say, this stuff is stuff that we've vetted and we've looked at and in some way endorsed. The question is, timing. How much this could be a huge, huge amount of time. So I think really, as I'm sort of talking aloud, let me touch base with the pro tem and see what she's thinking. But I do know people will look to us and Jane as well will say, what do you guys think of these kinds of things? So, Senator Chittenden.
So with that said, if the Education Committee is going to be a bellwether, so to speak, on things as important as the Select report, the one comment that has been festering as I continue to think, they presented us a plan A. I don't see a plan B or a plan C. So if we don't find $75 million for the next 5 years and a $22.5 million annual increase to 50.5, what are the other options? I didn't see that in the report, and I don't know if that's forthcoming or whatnot.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. Let me talk, I think this is a conversation with Senator Ballant and Senator Kitchell and see how they want to handle some of these kinds of things. To your point about just hearing other reports, and I need to follow up with you on your email because you have somebody that would like to come in and share some ideas as it relates to, let me just leave it there. Let me touch base with Senator Ballant and Senator Kitchell and get a better idea of how much time they want us to be doing this kind of vetting, or if it's a joint committee that we do with appropriations, that sort of thing. But I think we're all in agreement that we will start at taking a look at VSAC's bottom line proposal, knowing that there are other bills out there and we can spend an hour kind of carving it up and saying, hey, we like this part of it, we don't like this part of it. We want to add this from Senator Hardy's bill. We want to think Polina's right on this. But again, more with the eye to access to higher education, not getting into the reworking of the state colleges, just thinking about the financial assistance that we would give to students. Great. Any final questions?
This is really tough stuff. I don't know why people run for these offices.
Too late, Senator Chittenden.
Come on. All right. Thanks, everybody. I thought it was good discussions. Appreciate all of you and your work, and look forward to seeing you all soon.